He didn't even have the decency to show up himself. He sent a boy, couldn't have been more than 14, clutching a folded note like it was something ordinary, like he was delivering a grocery list instead of destroying a woman's life. The boy shoved the paper into Amelia Rose's hands without meeting her eyes, muttered something she didn't catch over the shriek of the departing train, and then turned and walked away. Just like that. Gone. She stood on the platform of Caldwell Station, Kansas, with a 2-year-old on her hip and a suitcase that held everything she owned in this world. The note was short, 4 lines. She read it twice because the first time her brain refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. I have reconsidered the arrangement. Do not come to the ranch. Do not attempt to contact me. There is nothing here for you. No name signed at the bottom. He hadn't even bothered with that. The train behind her belched a final cloud of black smoke and pulled away from the platform, taking with it the last of the afternoon passengers, the last of the noise, and the last of whatever thin hope Amelia had been carrying since she left Philadelphia 17 days ago. The platform emptied in under 3 minutes, and she was left standing there, a woman nobody had come for, in a town that didn't know she existed, holding a child who was starting to fuss because he was hungry and tired and too young to understand why his mother's face had gone completely still. She didn't cry. Not yet. She sat down on the nearest bench and stared at the horizon, and somewhere out there, beyond the dust and the flat brown grass and the sky that went on forever, a man named Gerald Fitch was going about his evening as though she was already forgotten. If you've ever traveled toward something with everything you had, only to find out it was never real, then you already know what Amelia was feeling in that moment. You don't need me to explain it. You just know. Before we go any further, if stories like this one reach you somewhere in your bones, do us both a favor and hit that subscribe button. I put out new stories every week, and I'd hate for you to miss what comes next. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Amelia, because what happens next is something nobody in Caldwell, Kansas saw coming. She had been warned. That was the part that would gnaw at her for years. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that she'd had warning signs and chosen to look past every single one of them. Her neighbor back in Philadelphia, Mrs. Hartwell, had stood in the doorway of Amelia's tenement apartment with her arms folded and her mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. "You don't know this man," Mrs. Hartwell had said. "You've exchanged 8 letters. 8 letters, Amelia. That's not a courtship. That's a conversation." "He owns land," Amelia had said, folding Eli's small shirt into the suitcase. "He's established. The agency verified him." "The agency verified that he exists and that he paid their fee. That is not the same thing as verifying his character." Amelia had smiled, patient, the way you smile at someone who loves you but doesn't understand. "I have nothing here, Mrs. Hartwell. My husband is dead. I work 12 hours a day at the laundry, and I still can't afford to keep Eli warm in winter. Gerald Fitch has a ranch and a house, and he wants a family. That's more than I have right now. Sometimes you take the chance that's in front of you." Mrs. Hartwell hadn't said anything else. She'd just hugged Amelia hard, pressed a small amount of money into her hand, money Amelia knew the old woman could barely spare, and made her promise to write. Amelia had promised. She hadn't written yet, because what would she say? "You were right." The note was still in her hand. She folded it carefully, like it was evidence of something, and tucked it into the front pocket of her traveling bag. Then she looked down at Eli, who had given up fussing and was now sleeping against her shoulder with his cheek pressed to her collarbone. That total boneless sleep that only small children can manage, completely trusting that the person holding them will handle whatever comes next. Amelia Rose was 26 years old. She had 43 cents to her name. She was sitting on a train platform bench in a town she'd never seen before, and the man who was supposed to be her future had sent a 14-year-old boy to do his dirty work. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute of pure, undiluted panic, the kind where your hands shake and your vision goes a little gray, and your brain starts cycling through worst-case scenarios at a speed that feels almost mechanical. 1 minute. She counted it out. Then she stopped. She had not hauled herself and her son 17 days across this country to fall apart on a train station bench. She shifted Eli's weight on her hip, straightened her back, and began to think. The station had a small office attached to it. She'd seen the station master duck inside about 20 minutes ago. She didn't know if he'd be of any use, but he was the only person she'd seen in the last half hour who hadn't immediately left. She stood, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the door. The station master's name was Carl Briggs, and he was a man who had spent 30 years watching human misery pass through his station and had learned to insulate himself from it with paperwork and deliberate obliviousness. When Amelia knocked and pushed open his door, he looked up from his ledger with the expression of a man who has already decided that whatever problem you're bringing him, it is not his problem. "Ticket office is closed," he said. "I don't need a ticket." Amelia set her suitcase down carefully so she wouldn't wake Eli. "I need to know if there are any boarding houses in town that might take in a woman with a small child, or if there's any kind of work available that I could—" "You the mail-order bride?" Briggs said. His voice wasn't unkind exactly, but it had the tone of someone reciting a fact rather than talking to a person. She kept her face neutral. "I was engaged to Gerald Fitch, yes." Briggs made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something in between. "Fitch sent word this morning that the arrangement was terminated. I figured you'd be coming in on the afternoon train." He looked at her for a moment, something almost apologetic crossing his face before he shut it down. "He's done this before. Different woman, 4 years back. She managed to get a return ticket from the agency's guarantee. Did yours have a guarantee?" Amelia felt the bottom of her stomach drop. The agency said there was a guarantee fund, but I'd have to contact them in writing and wait for processing. That could take weeks." "Well," Briggs looked back at his ledger. "Martha Greer runs a boarding house 2 blocks north on Mill Street. She's particular about who she takes, but she's not unreasonable. Tell her Carl sent you." He paused. "She charges $4 a week." $4 a week. Amelia had 43 cents. "Thank you," she said, and picked up her suitcase and walked back out into the evening air. She stood on the platform for a moment, doing the arithmetic that kept coming out the same impossible way, no matter how she arranged the numbers. The light was going golden and long, that particular quality of late afternoon on the plains where everything looks beautiful and nothing is actually better than it was 5 minutes ago. Eli stirred against her shoulder. "Mama," he murmured, still half asleep. "I'm here," she said. "Go back to sleep." He did. She started walking. Mill Street was easy enough to find. Caldwell wasn't a large town, more of a collection of buildings that had agreed to stand near each other out of mutual convenience. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had probably been respectable once, and was now working hard to maintain the appearance of respectability without fully committing to the effort. A painted sign by the door read, "Greer's, rooms for rent, respectable persons only." Amelia knocked. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair and the posture of someone who had decided long ago that good posture was one of the few things in life she could fully control. She looked at Amelia. She looked at Eli, who had woken up and was now regarding the woman with the solemn, wide-eyed scrutiny of a 2-year-old who isn't sure yet whether to be friendly or alarmed. "Carl Briggs sent me," Amelia said. "I've just arrived in town. I'm in a difficult circumstance and I need a room. I don't have money right now, but I'm willing to work. I'll clean, I'll cook, I'll do laundry, whatever you need." Martha Greer's expression didn't change. "The arrangement with Gerald Fitch fell through." "Yes." "How much money do you have?" Amelia didn't see any point in being anything other than honest. 43 cents. Something crossed Martha Greer's face, some not softness exactly, but an acknowledgement of something. She looked at Eli again. He was still watching her with those serious brown eyes, one small fist curled against Amelia's shoulder. "I have a room in the back," Martha said finally. "Small, 1 window. The mattress needs replacing and I haven't gotten around to it." "That's fine. I'll take work in exchange for room and board, but if I find it's not worth what you eat, we'll have to revisit the arrangement." "Understood. The child doesn't damage anything." "He won't." Martha stepped back from the door to let her in. The room was exactly as advertised. Small, 1 window facing the back alley, a mattress that had clearly seen better decades. But it had walls and a roof and a door that locked from the inside, and when Amelia set Eli down on the mattress and watched him immediately roll over and burrow into the blanket like a small animal finding its den, She felt something that was almost close to relief. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed in and breathed out. 43 cents, a lumpy mattress, a job cleaning someone else's house in exchange for a roof over her head. This was not the life she'd come here for, but it was a life. She hadn't lost that yet. She pulled out the letter she'd received from Gerald Fitch, not the dismissal note from today, but the original one, the courtship letter that had started all of this 3 months ago. She'd read it so many times that she practically had it memorized, but she read it again now with fresh eyes, looking for the things she'd missed. She found it almost immediately. She wondered how she hadn't seen it before. Every sentence was about what Amelia would provide: her domestic skills, her ability to manage a household, her capacity to care for any children they might have, her reputation for reliability, which he had apparently researched through the agency. Not one sentence asked anything about what she wanted. Not one sentence offered anything except the barest transactional minimum: room, board, and the legal protection of his name. She had read that letter as though it was an offer of partnership. It had been an inventory request. She folded it carefully and put it back in her bag. Then she lay down next to Eli, pulled the thin blanket over both of them, and stared at the ceiling of her very small room in a town she hadn't chosen, and began, with the particular determination of someone who has absolutely no other option, to figure out what came next. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Amelia worked. She woke before Martha Greer did, and had coffee on by the time the older woman came downstairs. She cleaned the common rooms, helped with laundry, and spent her evenings mending clothes that Martha's other boarders brought her in exchange for small amounts of cash, enough to begin, slowly, to accumulate something that felt less like 43 cents and more like a starting point. Ely adapted the way small children do, with a fluidity that adults lose somewhere along the way. He followed Amelia from room to room during her work, occupied with whatever he could find: a ball of yarn, a wooden spoon, a patch of sunlight on the floor that he seemed to find endlessly interesting. He was not a difficult child. He had learned early, perhaps too early, to occupy himself quietly. She had written to the matrimonial agency to begin the process of claiming the guarantee fund. The response, when it came 8 days later, was 3 paragraphs of careful legal language that essentially translated to, "We are sorry for your inconvenience. Processing takes 4 to 6 weeks. Please be patient." She had also, on Martha's suggestion, paid a visit to the office of the town's only attorney, a man named Horace Pell, who occupied a small office above the dry goods store and smelled strongly of pipe tobacco. She explained the situation. She asked whether Gerald Fitch could be held liable for the costs of her travel and her current circumstances. Pell had listened to all of it with his fingers pressed together. Then he'd said carefully, "Fitch is one of the largest landowners in this county, Mrs. Rose, and the matrimonial arrangement was informal enough that pursuing it legally would be complicated. Complicated meaning expensive, or complicated meaning unlikely to succeed? Both," he said, with what she had to admit was at least the courtesy of honesty. She thanked him and left. It was on the 9th day that everything shifted. She had gone to the general store for Martha, a short list, flour and salt, and a spool of thread, and was waiting at the counter while the proprietor, a man named Dawson, located the thread in the back. The store was busy for a Tuesday afternoon, 3 or 4 other customers milling about, and Amelia was standing to one side with Eli balanced on her hip when the door opened and Gerald Fitch walked in. She recognized him from the photograph the agency had sent, broader in person, heavier in the jaw, with a particular brand of self-satisfaction that some men wear like a second coat. He was with another man, taller and leaner, who was apparently the subject of whatever story Fitch was in the middle of telling. Fitch didn't notice her at first. He was laughing at something he'd just said. Then his eyes swept the store in the casual way of a man who owns things and landed on her, and his laughter stopped. The two of them looked at each other across the store. Amelia felt her heartbeat in her ears. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't let herself imagine it. She had exactly 3 seconds to decide how she was going to handle the next 30 seconds. And everything in her wanted to say something that would cost her later, something that would feel good for exactly as long as it took to say it, and bad for significantly longer. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. Fitch recovered his composure. He gave a brief nod. the kind of nod you give a stranger whose name you've forgotten, and turned back to his companion and resumed talking, a little too loudly, about something to do with cattle prices. Amelia turned back to the counter. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the countertop until they stopped. Dawson returned with the thread. She paid, collected the parcel, said thank you, and walked out with Eli on her hip and her back straight and her face composed, and she did not look back once. But as she stepped off the storefront porch and turned toward Mill Street, she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, deliberate. Not Fitch's heavy tread, but lighter, purposeful. "Excuse me." She turned. It was the man who had been with Fitch, the taller one, lean and sun-darkened, with the look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He'd followed her out of the store. He was holding his hat in his hands, which struck her as an oddly careful gesture. "I apologize for intruding," he said. "I just wanted to say—" He stopped, seeming to reconsidering whatever he'd planned to say. Started again. "I heard what happened at the station. My ranch is about 4 miles out, and word travels fast around here." He cleared his throat. "What Fitch did was wrong, and I'm sorry you're dealing with the fallout." Amelia looked at him. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with the kind of weathered face that made it hard to tell exactly. His eyes were direct without being aggressive, the kind of direct that came from being used to dealing with things honestly rather than carefully. "You're his neighbor?" she asked. "Adjacent property, yeah. Wyatt Cole." He didn't extend his hand because both of hers were occupied with Eli and the parcel, and the fact that he noticed that struck her as something. Amelia rose. "I know." He looked at Eli for a moment, not assessing, just acknowledging. "Look, I don't want to make your situation more complicated than it already is. I just wanted to say something because it seemed like someone ought to." He put his hat back on. "If you need anything while you're in town, if you get into a situation where things get tight, I've got a working ranch, and I'm not short of honest work. Martha Greer will vouch for me if you need a reference." He paused. "That's all I had to say. I'll leave you to your afternoon." He turned to go. "Mr. Cole," she said. He stopped. "Why?" Came out more bluntly than she intended, but she was tired, and tired people ask the questions they actually want answers to. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing. Why bother?" He considered this. "Because it was the right thing to do and nobody else was doing it," he said simply. And then he touched the brim of his hat and walked away. She didn't take him up on the offer. Not that day, not that week. She went back to Martha Greer's and put the flour and salt in the pantry and handed over the thread and helped with the supper and got Eli fed and settled, and she thought about Wyatt Cole's face when he said because it was the right thing to do. The complete absence of performance in it. He hadn't said it to impress her. He hadn't said it to make her feel indebted. He'd said it the way you state a thing that seems obvious. She thought about Gerald Fitch's careful nod across the store. She thought about the note the boy had handed her at the station. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell's folded arms and the weight of money pressed into her palm. She thought about a lot of things in those quiet hours after Eli was asleep, lying in the small back room with one window and a mattress that needed replacing, in a town she hadn't chosen. The thing was, she had planned her whole escape from her life in Philadelphia around the idea of someone else providing the foundation. Someone else's land, someone else's house, someone else's name. A man she'd exchanged 8 letters with would become the load-bearing wall of her entire future. It had seemed rational at the time. It had seemed like the only available option. But the wall had collapsed before she even arrived, and she was still standing. That was something, wasn't it? She wasn't sure yet what it was. But she fell asleep turning it over in her mind, and when she woke the next morning before dawn to put the coffee on, the question was still there, sitting at the back of her thoughts like an ember that hadn't quite gone out. It was the second Thursday, 11 days after her arrival in Caldwell, when things at Martha Greer's boarding house shifted in a direction Amelia hadn't anticipated. One of the other boarders, a traveling dry goods salesman named Doyle, had been increasingly difficult to deal with. He was the kind of man who thought that paying for a room entitled him to opinions about everything in it, including the quality of the food, the temperature of the water, and increasingly, the presence of a young woman and child in the household. That Thursday morning, Doyle came down to breakfast and announced to the table that he'd be looking for new accommodations if the situation with the stray wasn't resolved. The table went quiet. Amelia, who was clearing dishes from the far end, heard him perfectly. She set down the plate she was holding with great deliberateness and looked at Martha Greer, not at Doyle. Martha Greer was looking at her coffee cup. "Martha," Amelia said quietly, "do you need me to leave?" Martha looked up, and something in her expression, a tightening, a decision being made, answered the question before she opened her mouth. "No," Martha said. She looked at Doyle. "But I'll need your room by Friday, Mr. Doyle. I run a respectable house. Contempt for another boarder isn't respectable." Doyle blustered. Doyle threatened to spread word of Martha's establishment's decline in quality. Doyle ultimately packed his bags and left. The remaining boarders went back to their breakfasts. Amelia picked up the plate she'd set down and finished clearing the table, and did not allow herself to cry until she was alone in the kitchen with the door closed. Not because it had gone badly, because it had gone better than she deserved. And the specific sensation of someone taking your side when they didn't have to was still enough to undo her, even after everything. On the 14th day, she went looking for Wyatt Cole's ranch. Not because she'd given up. The opposite, actually. She'd spent 2 weeks building a temporary life out of whatever was available, and she'd proven to herself that she could do it, that she could keep Eli fed and herself employed and her dignity intact even when everything had gone sideways. But temporary wasn't the same as sustainable. $4 a week was what Martha's room cost. Mending clothes brought in maybe $2. The agency's guarantee fund was still 6 weeks away at best, and she had calculated 17 different ways to make those numbers work, and none of them left any room for error at all. She knew what Wyatt Cole's offer had been. She knew what it was likely to actually mean in practice. Hard physical work, irregular hours, the social complexity of a woman working on a man's ranch in a small frontier town in 1882. She also knew that she had options that were worse. The ranch was easy enough to find. She got directions from Martha without explaining why she was asking, which Martha allowed without commenting, which was one of the things Amelia was coming to appreciate about the woman. She walked the 4 miles with Eli on her hip for the first 2 and on his own feet, laboriously, with many digressions, for the last half mile. The day was clear and the air had that particular flat quality of the Great Plains in autumn, when the sky seems somehow larger than it does anywhere else on Earth. The ranch wasn't impressive in the way that Fitch's spread was apparently impressive. She'd heard people describe Fitch's operation as something close to a small empire. Cole's place was the opposite, solid, functional, every fence post doing the job it was there to do, and nothing decorative about any of it. The house was 2 stories, weathered gray-brown wood, with a porch that had clearly been repaired multiple times in multiple places. The yard held a barn, 2 outbuildings, and enough equipment scattered around to suggest ongoing work rather than display. Wyatt Cole was in the yard when she arrived, arguing with a piece of machinery. He looked up when he heard the gate, and his expression moved through surprise and then settled somewhere around careful. "Mrs. Rose." "Mr. Cole." She stopped about 10 feet away. Eli was examining a rock he'd found in the yard with intense scientific interest. "I've thought about your offer. If it's still open, I'd like to talk about it." He considered her for a moment. Not suspicious, not calculating, just looking. "Still open," he said. "Come on up to the porch." They sat across from each other in mismatched chairs on that battered porch, and Amelia told him the truth. All of it. The 43 cents, the agency's timeline. Martha Greer's generosity and its limits. The meeting with Fitch in the general store, and the careful nod that had made her hands shake. She told it plain, without editorializing, without asking for anything except to be heard clearly before any agreement was made. Wyatt listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a tin cup of coffee that he'd brought out for himself and offered one to her, which she'd accepted, and he seemed to use the cup as something to do with his hands while she talked. When she finished, he said, "I've got 2 ranch hands, older guys, Pete and Charlie. Been here longer than the fence posts. They're good people. You wouldn't have any trouble from them." "I'm not worried about trouble," she said. "I'm worried about being fair." "What are you actually short of that I could help with?" That seemed to land right with him. He thought about it seriously rather than reflexively. "Cooking, mostly. Pete does it currently, but Pete's cooking is why Charlie lost 12 pounds last year. Supply runs. Some record keeping. I'm not good with paper. The house needs more work than one person can keep up with alongside everything else. I can do all of that. In exchange for room, board, and..." He named a figure. It wasn't large. It was larger than what she was making currently. "One condition," she said. "Eli is with me. He's 2. He won't damage anything and he won't be in the way, but he doesn't go somewhere separate while I work." Wyatt looked at Eli, who had transferred his scientific attention from the rock to a beetle he'd found on the porch railing. "That's not a condition," he said. "That's just obvious." Amelia looked at him. "Most people would have made it a condition." "Most people would have," he agreed, and left it at that. She thought she was beginning to understand something about Wyatt Cole. He wasn't generous in the showy way. He wasn't performing kindness, wasn't making sure she noticed how decent he was being. He was just deciding what the right thing was and doing it without turning it into a production. It was, she thought, a rarer quality than it should have been. "When can you start?" he asked. Amelia looked out at the flat, wide plains stretching beyond the fence line. All that sky, all that distance, and somewhere in it, a future that bore no resemblance to the one she'd planned. "Tomorrow," she said. "If that works." "Tomorrow works," Wyatt Cole said. Eli looked up from the beetle. He had apparently decided it was time to contribute to the conversation. "Horsey?" he said, pointing hopefully toward the barn. Wyatt Cole looked at the boy for a moment, and something in his face shifted, quiet, almost private. "Yeah," he said. "We got horses. We'll go look in a minute." And that, of all things, was what made Amelia's eyes sting. Not the offer, not the wage, not the fact that a stranger had done what a promised husband would not, but a grown man using a boy's word without any self-consciousness at all. "Yeah, we got horses." She looked at the horizon and blinked and kept her face steady. She had work to do tomorrow. She had a life to build. She wasn't finished yet, not by a long distance, not by a long distance at all. She moved in the next morning with everything she owned, which was still the same small suitcase and the same child and 43 cents that had now become $1.68, the accumulated result of 2 weeks of mending and careful spending. Martha Greer stood in the doorway of the boarding house when Amelia left and said nothing except, "Take care of yourself," which for Martha was practically a declaration of love. The 4 miles to the ranch felt different walking toward something rather than away from nothing. Eli walked most of it himself this time, stopping every 20 yards to examine something on the ground. A feather, a pebble that caught the light, a dried beetle husk, with the same rigorous attention he'd been giving the world since he learned to walk. Amelia let him. She had nowhere to be except where she was going, and she'd learned in the last 2 weeks that rushing Eli produced exactly the same results as not rushing him, minus everyone's dignity. Pete and Charlie were already in the yard when she arrived. She'd been told they were older, and they were Pete somewhere in his 60s, weathered to something close to wood, with a white mustache and the permanent squint of a man who'd spent decades reading weather. Charlie a few years younger, taller, with a slow way of moving that she'd later learn wasn't laziness, but a bad knee he'd been managing for 15 years without complaint. They watched her come through the gate with the particular assessment of men who have been working the same land long enough to feel proprietary about changes to the arrangement. "This is Mrs. Rose," Wyatt said, from where he'd been waiting by the porch steps. "And Eli." Pete looked at Eli. Eli looked at Pete with the unblinking seriousness that small children reserve for people they're not sure about yet. Pete said, "How old?" "2, Amelia said. "Boy that age will eat a surprising amount," Pete said. It was not a complaint. It was the statement of someone who considers feeding people an important subject and wanted to establish he was thinking about it. "He does," Amelia agreed. Charlie nodded at her once. Not unfriendly, just economical. He had the look of a man who had decided long ago that words were a finite resource and should be conserved accordingly. Wyatt showed her the house. The kitchen first because that was the most immediately relevant, large by frontier standards, with a wood stove that had seen hard use and a pantry that was better stocked than she'd expected. There was a bedroom on the ground floor, small, at the back of the house, which he'd apparently cleared of stored equipment over the last day. He didn't comment on that, and she didn't ask. "The house was my wife's territory," he said, at one point, not looking at her, looking at the kitchen window instead, at the yard beyond it. "She passed 4 years ago. I've kept it functional, but I haven't—" He stopped, started again. "There are things that have needed attention for a while that I haven't gotten to." She understood what he wasn't saying. The house wasn't just a practical problem. It was a space that had belonged to someone who was no longer in it, and he'd been living around the edges of that absence rather than moving through it. "I'll only do what's necessary," she said. "If there's anything you'd prefer I leave alone, tell me." He looked at her then, briefly. "Thank you," he said, and moved on to showing her the supply room. The first week was the hardest. Not because the work was beyond her, but because learning a household that isn't yours is a specific kind of labor that nobody really acknowledges. Every ranch has its rhythms. When people wake, what order things get done. The 100 small preferences and habits that accumulate over years until they feel like facts about the world, rather than choices anyone made. Getting those wrong was inevitable, and Amelia got them wrong regularly, cooking too much of one thing and not enough of another, not knowing that Charlie couldn't eat onions because of a stomach complaint he'd had for years, not knowing that Pete preferred his coffee made strong enough to stand a spoon in and was quietly unhappy about anything less. She found these things out gradually, by watching and asking, and sometimes just by the particular silences that people produce around things they don't want to say directly. By the end of the first week, she had Charlie's coffee right. Pete's portion sizes were proving more ambitious. Eli settled into the ranch with an adaptability that continued to astonish her. He had identified the horses as the most important feature of his new environment and conducted daily inspections of the barn with the gravity of a small official on a very serious assignment. Wyatt had shown him, on the second morning, how to hold his palm flat so a horse could take a piece of apple without taking any fingers, and Eli had stood there with his small hand extended and his breath held and his eyes enormous, and the horse, a big gray named Franklin, who was, according to Pete, getting old and getting particular about everything, had taken the apple with the delicate precision of an animal that had been around long enough to be gentle about it. Eli had immediately turned to find the nearest adult to report this event to, which happened to be Wyatt, and had announced with enormous satisfaction, "He ate it." "He did," Wyatt had confirmed with the gravity the moment deserved. That was the second day. By the fifth day, Eli was calling the horse Frank, and Wyatt had taken to lifting the boy up for a look into the stall when they passed in the morning, which had become a routine neither of them seemed to have decided on. It had simply accumulated, the way small things do when nobody's trying to stop them. Amelia watched this and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not quite gratitude. Something more complicated than that. The particular unease of watching your child attached to something you're not sure is permanent. She kept working. The town's opinion of the situation at Cole's Ranch arrived in her awareness the way most social weather does. Indirectly, through the atmosphere rather than through direct statement. It was on her second supply run into Caldwell. She'd taken the wagon, which she'd driven twice now and was developing a grudging competence with, that she first felt it clearly. Dawson's general store was busy, and she was working through Wyatt's list when she became aware of a conversation happening in the adjacent aisle that had not quite stopped when she came in but had become notably quieter. Two women. She didn't know their names yet. One of them said something she didn't quite catch, and the other one said clearly enough, "I just think it reflects poorly on the situation." Amelia kept her eyes on the shelving in front of her and continued locating items. "She came in as a mail-order bride," the first voice said, quieter now, but not quiet enough. "And now she's living in his house. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying." "Nobody's saying anything," the second voice agreed, in the tone of someone saying quite a lot. Amelia put 2 tins of salt in her basket and moved to the next item on the list. She had known this was coming. She'd known it the day she walked through Wyatt's gate. A woman in a man's house in 1882 who had arrived as a mail-order bride and hadn't married the man she'd come for. She could have told you herself exactly what the town's version of that story would look like and how fast it would spread. Knowing didn't make it better exactly, but it made it something she'd prepared for, which was different from being blindsided. What she hadn't prepared for was Wyatt's reaction to it. She told him that evening, not to complain, but because she thought he should know what was circulating, since it affected his reputation as much as hers, and she felt it was fair to give him the information. She kept her voice matter-of-fact and her account brief. He listened with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was difficult to read. When she finished, he said, "Who was it?" "I didn't recognize them." "What did they look like?" She described them. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's probably Ruth Calloway and Ellen Marsh. They're—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. They've been unkind to people before, people they decided weren't proper. I'm not asking you to do anything about it, Amelia said. I just thought you should know. I appreciate that. He uncrossed his arms. I'll say something to people if it gets worse. Small towns. If you don't push back on certain things, they tend to get bigger. She looked at him. What would you say? The truth, he said simply. That you're working here. That you're being paid for the work. That you've been treated badly enough by one person in this town, and I have no interest in the rest of them piling on. He paused. Unless that would bother you. Some people prefer to be left out of other people's defenses. She thought about it. I've been left out of my own defenses often enough, she said. I don't mind someone else doing the talking for once. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, just around the edges. All right, he said. Well, Gerald Fitch came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Amelia had moved in. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses in the yard, and something in the quality of Wyatt's voice when he went out, a particular flatness that she'd come to recognize as the voice he used when he was working to keep something contained, made her pause what she was doing and move closer to the window. Fitch was on horseback, with 2 of his ranch hands behind him. He looked at ease, which was itself a kind of aggression. The ease of a man who has decided in advance that this is his territory, and the other person in it is a guest by his tolerance. Cole, he said. Fitch. Heard you took in a stray. He said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he'd said it with contempt. Good of you. Always were soft-hearted about that sort of thing. What do you want? Wyatt's voice was even. Just being neighborly. I was in the area. Fitch's eyes drifted toward the house, toward the window where Amelia was standing just out of his direct line of sight. I want you to understand there's no bad feeling on my end about the woman. These arrangements don't always work out. Better to find out before the fact than after. You could have paid her return fare, Wyatt said, instead of leaving her stranded. Fitch's pleasantness didn't shift exactly, but something behind it did. A tightening, barely perceptible. Agency'll handle her fare. In 6 weeks, after she's been sitting in a strange town with 40 cents in her pocket and a 2-year-old. I'm not responsible for her planning. You made an arrangement, Wyatt said. You broke it. In this part of the country, that used to mean something. The pleasantness was definitely gone now. Fitch looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who is recalibrating how much patience he's willing to spend on this conversation. I came to be neighborly, he said, not to be lectured by a man whose own affairs aren't exactly above reproach. My affairs are fine, Wyatt said. Is there anything else? There was a beat, the kind of beat that contains a decision being made. Then Fitch turned his horse and said, without looking back, I'll be keeping an eye on things, Cole. That's all. The 3 of them rode out. Amelia stepped back from the window and went back to the stove. Her hands weren't shaking this time. She wasn't sure if that meant she was getting tougher or just more tired. The 2 feelings were similar enough that she'd stopped trying to distinguish between them. Wyatt came into the kitchen a few minutes later. He didn't announce what had happened, and she didn't tell him she'd heard it. Anything I can do? She asked, because it seemed like the thing to offer. No, he said. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the yard. I'm sorry about that. He'll keep coming back, she said. It wasn't a question. Probably. He turned from the window. Fitch doesn't like being made to look bad, and me taking you in makes him look bad. A pause. Not that that changes anything. I know, she said. I just wanted to say it plainly so it's out there. He nodded. They both went back to their separate work, and the morning continued, and the conversation settled into the walls of the house like a lot of conversations before it, unresolved, but at least honest. It was Pete who told her about Wyatt's wife. She hadn't asked. She would not have asked. It wasn't information she felt entitled to, and she had a sense that Wyatt's silences around certain subjects were protective rather than secretive. But Pete had a habit of talking while he worked, a running commentary on whatever he was doing that sometimes shifted into territory he probably hadn't entirely planned. They were in the barn one afternoon, Pete repairing a harness, Amelia having come out to collect Eli, who had spent the last 2 hours in Pete's company and had apparently been learning how to braid leather, with mixed but enthusiastic results. She was from Missouri, Pete said, not looking up from the harness. Sarah. Came out here when she was 22. She and Wyatt had been writing for about a year before she came out, but she wasn't a mail-order situation, not exactly. She was a school teacher, had a cousin in Caldwell, came out to visit, and didn't go back. He turned the harness over in his hands. They had a girl, Clara. She would have been 4 now. Amelia stayed very still. Both of them went in the same week, Pete said. Fever, summer of '78. He was quiet for a moment, just the sound of the barn, the horses, the creak of old wood. Wyatt didn't leave the ranch for about 2 months after. Charlie and we just kept things going and waited him out. Eventually he came back to himself. Mostly. Mostly? Amelia said quietly. He's a good man, Pete said. Just one that's learned not to hold things too close, because holding things close has cost him. He looked at her then, direct and not unkind. I'm telling you this so you understand him better, not for any other reason. I understand, she said. Good. He looked back down at the harness. The boy's getting pretty decent at the braid, all things considered. Might have a future in it. Eli, who had clearly not been following any of this conversation, held up his small section of braided leather with enormous pride. Amelia looked at it. It was, to be fair, not bad. Very good, she told him, and meant it. She carried that information back to the house and set it down somewhere inside herself where she wouldn't trip over it. Wyatt Cole had built his life around loss the same way she'd built hers around abandonment, carefully, keeping the structure functional while trying not to look directly at the gap where something used to be. They were both people who had learned to work around damage rather than through it. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure it called for doing anything at all. Oh, the first real crisis on the ranch came 6 days later, in the form of a broken water line to the eastern pasture and 30 cattle that needed moving before the alternative watering point was rigged up. It was a full-day emergency, both ranch hands plus Wyatt out in the field from sunup. And Amelia was left in the house with Eli and a list of things that needed to be done and the knowledge that dinner would need to be ready for 4 exhausted people by the time the light went. She managed the list. She made dinner, a substantial pot of beef stew using the last of last week's roast, and whatever vegetables she could assemble, with cornbread because she'd learned by now that Pete considered a meal without bread to be an incomplete experience. She got Eli fed and cleaned and down for his afternoon sleep. She went through the supply ledger and updated the records that Wyatt had said he was behind on. She found, in the process of going through the supply ledger, a discrepancy in the hardware purchases that she couldn't account for. The numbers added up, but the quantities delivered didn't match what was recorded. It was small, but it was there. She made a note of it separately. She wasn't sure what it meant and didn't want to raise it until she did. When the men came back at dusk, dirty, worn through, the particular emptied-out look of people who have spent 10 hours solving a problem with their bodies rather than their minds. Dinner was on the table and the ledger was updated, and Eli was sitting by the window watching for horses with the devotion of a small sentinel. Pete sat down at the table and looked at the stew and the bread and said, with complete sincerity, "This is the best kitchen in the county. I will fight anyone who disagrees." Charlie said nothing but ate 3 servings, which was its own statement. Wyatt sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking much, which was normal. But at some point during the meal, he looked across the table at her and said, "How were the records?" "Updated through the end of the month," she said, "and there's a discrepancy in the hardware account I want to show you when you have a moment." He put down his fork. "What kind of discrepancy?" "Small, probably an error, but I wanted to flag it." He looked at her for a moment. "Show me after supper." She did. They sat at the kitchen table after Pete and Charlie had gone to their bunks, Eli asleep in the back room, the lamp turned up between them over the ledger, and she walked him through what she'd found. He was quiet while she explained it, following the numbers with a focus that told her this wasn't the first time a discrepancy had appeared and not been caught. "When did this start?" he asked. "Based on the records I have access to, 6 months ago. Maybe before." She paused. "I can't tell you whether it's a mistake or something else without more records than I've seen." He sat back. The look on his face was the one she'd started to recognize as the look he used when he was working through something that had gotten larger than expected. "The hardware account goes through Dawson's store," he said, "and there's been a hired hand managing the supply orders since January who left in March." A pause. "His name was Rudd. He didn't give much notice." "That's not enough to draw a conclusion. Amelia said carefully. No, Wyatt agreed. But it's enough to start paying attention. He looked at the ledger again, then at her. This would have gone unnoticed for another year if you hadn't been in here. I was just doing the records. You were doing the records well, he said. It wasn't flattery. It was the same tone he used to say anything that was factually the case, even, direct, without decoration. She felt something warm and slightly uncomfortable move through her chest, and she redirected her attention to closing the ledger. I'll note the dates and amounts on a separate sheet, she said, in case you want to take it to anyone. Yeah, he said, that would be good. They sat there for another minute, the lamp between them, the house quiet. Outside, the plains were enormous and dark and completely indifferent to any of it. I need to tell you something, Amelia said. He waited. When you offered me this job, I calculated it as a temporary arrangement, something until the agency fund came through and I could make different plans. She looked at the ledger rather than at him. I've been treating it that way in my head, which means I've been keeping a kind of distance, professionally. I know, he said. She looked up. You know? I figured it was the sensible approach, he said. Under the circumstances. She wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. The simplicity of it, the complete absence of offense in it, caught her off guard. It is the sensible approach, she said, after a moment. Probably, he agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The lamp flickered. I found a letter today, she said. In the supply correspondence, not your correspondence, the old hands. A letter from someone named Keswick about a land boundary line. The language was odd, I kept it. Wyatt's expression sharpened slightly. Keswick, he said. He's one of Fitch's men. Amelia looked at him steadily. I know, she said. That's why I kept it. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when two people simultaneously realize that the problem in front of them is considerably larger than either of them had been prepared to deal with, and neither of them is going to say that out loud because it doesn't help. Show me the letter, Wyatt said. She retrieved it from where she'd put it, between 2 pages of the supply ledger, and laid it on the table between them. He read it twice. She watched his face. The boundary line it references, he said finally. That's a line that has been in dispute since before I bought this land. Fitch has always claimed his fence was placed correctly. My deed says different. He set the letter down. This is someone inside my operation passing information to Fitch about the state of my records. Yes, Amelia said, which means Fitch knew the discrepancy was there before I did. That's what it looks like. Wyatt sat very still for a long moment. Then he picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. You've been here less than a month, he said, and you found something that someone has been hiding for at least 6. I was doing the records, she said again. You were doing the records well, he said again. And this time she didn't redirect. She let it land. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to think carefully, he said, before I do anything. He pushed back from the table. That's the part I usually rush. Thinking carefully. She nodded. He took the lamp to start locking up the house, and she sat in the sudden near dark for a moment before getting up. The ranch creaked around her in the night. Outside, the wind moved across the plains the way it always did, steady and low and indifferent. She could hear Eli breathing in the back room, that small regular sound that she had calibrated herself to register even through sleep. She had come here with 43 cents and a suitcase and a plan that had collapsed on a train platform. She was now, 4 weeks later, living on a ranch she'd never expected to be in, working for a man she hadn't known existed a month ago, and sitting on evidence that Gerald Fitch, the man who had sent a 14-year-old boy to destroy her life with 4 sentences on a folded note, was apparently in the process of trying to do something similar to Wyatt Cole, just with more paperwork. Life on the frontier, she was learning, had a particular sense of humor. She got up, checked on Eli, and went to bed. Tomorrow the work would be there. The problem would be there. The evidence would be in Wyatt's pocket, and what he decided to do about it would determine a great deal about what came next. She had stopped making plans that depended on other people holding up their end, but she hadn't stopped paying attention. That, as it turned out, was already more useful than any plan she could have made. Wyatt spent 3 days thinking carefully, which he'd said was the part he usually rushed, and Amelia could see him doing it. The way a man carries a problem in his body without announcing it, The slight distraction at the supper table. The extra time he spent in the barn after the day's work was technically done, standing with Frank's big gray head against his shoulder and not particularly doing anything except existing near an animal that didn't require explanations. She didn't push. She had the separate sheet of figures ready, dates, amounts, quantities, folded and sitting in the supply ledger where he could find it when he was ready. She had her own thoughts about what the letter from Keswick meant and what it implied about the scope of what Fitch was doing, but they were her thoughts and not her ranch. And she had learned in the last month that the speed at which Wyatt Cole made decisions was directly related to how confident she could be that he'd actually followed them through. On the fourth day, he told her he was riding into town to see Horace Pell. "The attorney," she said. "Yeah." He was saddling Franklin, not looking at her. "I know you've already had a conversation with him about your own situation." "He was honest about what wasn't worth pursuing," she said. "I think that's probably a good quality in a lawyer, even when you don't want to hear it." Wyatt grunted, which she was learning to read as a form of agreement. He finished with the saddle and turned to her. "I'll be back by supper. Can you manage the afternoon supply check without me?" "I've been managing it without you for 2 weeks," she said pleasantly. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity. "Right," he said. "I'll be back by supper." He was back by supper. He didn't tell her what Pell had said until after Pete and Charlie had gone, and Eli was down, and they were sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight that had become their unofficial location for conversations that required actual attention. "Pell says the boundary dispute is real, and it's been real for 20 years, Wyatt said. "The original survey was done badly. There's about 40 acres that could legally be argued either direction depending on which deed language you prioritize." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Fitch has been quietly building a case for 3 years. According to Pell, he filed a preliminary claim with the county land office 8 months ago, before I knew anything about it." Amelia absorbed this. "And the Keswick letter? Someone feeding him information about your records. Makes it worse," Wyatt said. "If Fitch can argue that I've been mismanaging the land, that my supply accounts don't balance, that my records are inconsistent, it supports a claim that I'm not maintaining the property properly." He set the cup down. "It's not the strongest legal argument, but combined with the boundary dispute and the right judge on a bad day, it's enough to make things complicated." "What does Pell recommend?" "He recommends I get my records in perfect order immediately, file a counterclaim with the land office to establish my position formally, and," he paused, "find out how far the information leak went, whether Rudd was working alone or whether there's still someone passing things along." Amelia looked at the ledger on the table between them. She'd been through every page of it now, twice. She knew those numbers the way you know a piece of music after you've played it enough. Not just the notes, but the rhythm, the places where something didn't quite fit the pattern. "There's one more thing," she said. She'd been sitting on it for 2 days, wanting to be sure before she said anything. "In the March supply orders, there's a repeating entry for fence post materials. The quantities are right for what's listed, but the delivery location isn't specified, which is different from every other delivery in the ledger. Every other order has a location. These don't." Wyatt was very still. "Fence posts for 40 unspecified acres," Amelia said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "He was using my supply account to fence land he was already planning to claim." "That's what it looks like." Wyatt pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the dark yard. She waited. The house ticked and settled around them in the way old houses do, adjusting to the night temperature. "I'm going to need you to write all of this down," he said finally. "Everything, dates, entries, the Keswick letter, the fence post orders. A full account in your handwriting with your signature on it. Because your handwriting on your own records can be dismissed," she said. "Because a separate witness account is harder to dismiss," he said. Pell's words. She nodded. "I'll have it ready in 2 days." He turned from the window. In the lamplight, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's physical work. The tired that comes from realizing that a threat you hadn't seen coming has been building for longer than you knew. She recognized that particular tired. She'd felt it herself, reading a 4-line note on a train platform. "I'm sorry this is your problem to deal with," she said. "You brought me here to cook and keep records, not to—" "You found it," he said. "That's what matters." "Someone would have found it eventually." Maybe, he said, or Fitch would have filed his formal claim in the spring, and I'd have been 3 years behind in understanding what I was dealing with. He looked at her steadily. Don't minimize what you did. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. Good night, Mrs. Rose. Good night, Mr. Cole. She went to her room and lay in the dark, listening to the plains wind and thinking about 40 acres of fenced land, and a man who had planned this so carefully for so long that he had apparently considered every angle except the one where the woman he'd discarded at a train station ended up doing someone else's bookkeeping. The document took her 2 days. She was thorough in a way that surprised her. Not just the figures, but the context. Where she'd found each anomaly, what led her to look at that particular entry, what alternative explanations she'd considered and why they didn't hold up. She had Wyatt read it before she signed it, because she wanted him to tell her if she'd gotten anything wrong, rather than have it matter later. He read it slowly, twice. You should have been a lawyer, he said. Women aren't lawyers, she said. Yet, he said, and handed it back to her. She signed it. He took it to Pell, and then they waited, which was its own kind of labor. The work of keeping a ranch running and a household maintained and Eli fed and generally happy, while a legal and territorial problem accumulated somewhere just off to the side of everything, not gone, but not yet arrived either. It was during this waiting period that the town's opinion of Amelia Rose began to shift, in the subtle but unmistakable way that small-town opinion shifts. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in the accumulation of small moments that suddenly add up to a different picture. Part of it was practical. She had started going to Dawson's store for the weekly supply run, and she was good at it. She knew the list, she knew what could be substituted and what couldn't. She remembered what Pete had said about the quality of the last batch of salt pork, and mentioned it to Dawson directly and without drama, which Dawson responded to better than he might have if someone had complained. She was, in other words, a competent person doing a job, which is not glamorous but turns out to be one of the more reliable ways to get people to see you clearly. Part of it was Eli. Small children are a particular kind of social lubricant in a frontier town, where children are common and generally considered a good thing. And Eli had the kind of face, open, serious, enormous eyes, that invited adults to demonstrate their best selves at him. He had started saying hello to people on the street, which, given his age, was more of a solemnly extended hand and a grave hello that reduced grown men to embarrassing levels of warmth. Mrs. Calloway, one of the 2 women from the general store aisle, the one who had said, "I'm just saying," stopped Amelia on the street one Tuesday to admire Eli's hat, which was a small battered thing Amelia had mended twice, and which Eli had recently decided was essential to his identity. Mrs. Calloway was not warm about it, exactly, but she was civil, which was a distinct improvement over whatever "I'm just saying" had been. And part of it, Amelia suspected, was Wyatt Cole himself. Not through any particular action, but through the simple social fact that Wyatt Cole was a known and respected man in this community, and people who respected him tended to at least partly revise their view of whatever he'd decided was worth his time. She didn't find this entirely comfortable. She didn't want to be respectable by proxy. She'd done that for most of her adult life. First as someone's daughter, then as someone's wife, then almost as someone's mail-order acquisition. And she was tired of the version of herself that only made sense in relation to someone else's position. But she was also honest enough to recognize that she was in no position to turn down whatever goodwill was on offer, regardless of how it arrived. Fitch came back to the ranch on a Friday, and this time he didn't pretend to be neighborly. He came alone, which was either less threatening or more, depending on how you read it. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the porch with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided to handle something himself. Amelia was on the porch when he arrived. She'd been mending a pair of Pete's work trousers and hadn't heard the horse until he was already through the gate. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Cole here?" he said. "He's in the south field," she said. "I can send someone." "That won't be necessary." He put one boot on the porch step and leaned against the railing with the posture of a man settling in. "I'll wait. And while I wait, maybe you and I can have a conversation." "I'm busy," she said, and went back to the mending. He watched her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who is not used to being politely dismissed and is deciding how to feel about it. "You know what you've gotten yourself into," he said. "Don't you, being here?" She kept her eyes on the stitching. I know exactly what I'm doing, Mr. Fitch. I work here. I'm paid for the work. It's a straightforward arrangement. Cole's going to lose this property, Fitch said. Not this year, maybe not next. But it's going to happen. That boundary dispute has been unresolved for 20 years, and I have the resources to resolve it in my favor, which means whatever arrangement you have with him. He spread his hands. You're building on sand, Mrs. Rose. She set the mending down on her knee and looked at him directly for the first time. He had the self-satisfaction back now. Not the pleasantness from the first visit, but the underlying version of it, the one that believed itself to be stating plain facts. You sent a boy to give me a note on a train platform, she said. You didn't even sign your name to it. He blinked. He hadn't been expecting her to go there. The arrangement was something you decided to end without the basic courtesy of doing it yourself, she said. You could have written to me before I left Philadelphia. You could have met the train and spoken to me like a person. Instead, you sent a 14-year-old child with 4 sentences. She picked the mending back up. That's who you are, Mr. Fitch. And now you're standing on someone else's porch telling me their land is sand. You'll understand if I don't find your judgment particularly reliable. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who has been said a true thing to and doesn't have a response, because the only available responses are bad ones. Fitch straightened from the railing. The pleasant surface was entirely gone now. You're making a mistake, he said, and it came out flat and mean in a way the pleasantness had been covering. I've made mistakes, she said. Trusting your letter was one of them. I seem to be correcting my record. He stood there for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode out without another word. Amelia sat very still until the sound of his horse faded completely. Then she looked down at the mending and realized she'd put the needle through the wrong layer of fabric and would have to redo the last 4 stitches. She pulled them out and started again. Her hands were steady. She had not been completely steady on the inside, but he didn't get to know that, and he wasn't going to. Wyatt came back from the south field about 40 minutes later. Pete had apparently sent word because he came at a pace slightly faster than his usual, and when he came around to the porch and she told him what had happened, he sat down on the porch steps and listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What did he say exactly at the end?" She told him. "He said you were making a mistake." He was quiet for a moment. Did he say it like a warning or like a threat? She thought about it. Like a threat that wanted to be taken for a warning. Wyatt nodded slowly. "We need to talk to Pell again. Soon." He looked out at the gate where Fitch's horse had been. "I've been waiting to see if he'd come at this legally or through other means. Now I know it's both." "There's something else," Amelia said. She'd been thinking about it since Fitch rode away. He said the boundary dispute has been unresolved for 20 years, and he has the resources to resolve it in his favor. He didn't say he had the legal standing. He said resources. Wyatt turned to look at her. "That's a specific word choice," she said. "Resources could mean lawyers. It could also mean the right judge," Wyatt said, "or the right official at the land office. I don't know. I'm speculating." "You're thinking clearly," he said, "which is more than I've been managing lately." He rubbed his face with one hand, a gesture she'd come to associate with him arriving at the edge of his patience with something. "My father used to say that the biggest mistake you can make on the frontier is assuming the other man is playing the same game you are." "He wasn't wrong," Amelia said. "No." Wyatt stood up. "I'll ride to Pell's in the morning." He paused. "That was what you said to him. That was well done." "I didn't plan it," she said. "I was just tired of watching him perform." "Sometimes that's the best time to say the honest thing," he said, "when you're too tired to edit it." She looked at him. There was something in his expression that she was not yet prepared to name and did not try to. Something that had been accumulating in the small daily proximity of the last month, and that she was keeping in her peripheral vision rather than looking at directly, for reasons she understood well enough not to examine too closely. "I'll have supper on in an hour," she said, and went inside. The letter from the matrimonial agency arrived 11 days later. It came in the regular post, which Pete collected from town on Wednesdays, and it was sitting on the kitchen table when Amelia came in from hanging laundry, a small envelope with the agency's Philadelphia return address, which she recognized immediately and which caused something to go tight in her chest before she'd even picked it up. She opened it at the table, standing, because somehow sitting down felt like making too much of it. The guarantee fund payment was enclosed, a banker's draft for the amount agreed. The letter accompanying it was brief and impersonal, expressing regret for the inconvenience of the arrangement's termination, confirming this completed the agency's obligation under the guarantee terms and wishing her well in her future endeavors. Future endeavors. She set the letter down and looked at the draft. It was enough to get back to Philadelphia, enough to establish herself somewhere else, not lavishly, but adequately, with enough cushion to find work before she was desperate. It was, in practical terms, the exit she had been waiting for since the day she arrived in Caldwell with 43 cents and a suitcase. She stood there for a long time. Eli was in the barn with Pete, which was where he spent most of his mornings now. She could hear distantly Pete's voice and then Eli's voice, though she couldn't make out the words, just the pattern of conversation, question and answer, older person and small child doing the old important work of the world passing itself down. She picked up the draft and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the laundry. She didn't say anything to Wyatt that day, or the next day. She needed to think, and thinking about this particular thing required a kind of honesty that she had not entirely prepared herself for. What she had built here in 6 weeks on this ranch was not what she'd come to the frontier for. It was not a husband, not a legal arrangement, not a deed with her name on it. What she had was work she was good at, and records she'd kept that might matter in a legal dispute that was not hers, and a child who spent his mornings learning about horses from an old man with a white mustache, and evenings following Wyatt Cole across the yard like a small shadow that Wyatt had gradually, without appearing to make a decision about it, stopped pretending not to notice. She admitted to herself on the third night of not sleeping particularly well, been building something. She just wasn't sure she'd been admitting to herself that she was doing it. On the fourth day, she knocked on the door of Wyatt's small office, a room off the main hallway that smelled of dust and leather and the accumulated paperwork of a working ranch, and stood in the doorway until he looked up from whatever he was writing. The agency payment came, she said. She put it on the desk between them. 4 days ago. He looked at the draft, then at her. You've been sitting on this for 4 days. I was thinking. What were you thinking about? She'd decided she was going to say this plainly because plain was the only way she knew how to say important things without talking herself out of them halfway through. Whether to use it to leave, she said, or whether to tell you I'd like to stay on, if the work is still useful, and put it towards something else. Wyatt was very still. She stopped, started again. I'm not saying this because of anything other than what it is. The work is real, and I'm good at it. The legal situation with Fitch isn't resolved, and she looked somewhere slightly to the left of his face. Eli is happy here. That matters to me. Is that all of it? Wyatt asked. His voice was completely even, which could mean anything. No, she said, but the rest of it I'm not ready to say yet. I wanted to give you the honest part first. He looked at the draft on the desk for a moment. Then he picked it up and held it out to her. Keep it, he said. Don't put it toward anything. Keep it so it's yours regardless of what happens. She took it back. I want you to stay, he said. The work is real, and you're better at it than I said when I offered the job. The legal situation needs you. He paused. And the rest of it, I'm not ready to say yet either. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the draft in her hand and the lamp burning low on his desk, and the sound of Pete and Charlie somewhere outside and Eli's distant voice, and felt the particular sensation of being somewhere she had not planned to be and finding that she did not, for the first time in a long time, want to be anywhere else. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. She went back to the kitchen. He went back to whatever he'd been writing, and the ranch continued as it always did with all of its ordinary and essential work, the kind that doesn't pause for the complicated things people feel, but just keeps being there to be done, which is sometimes exactly the right condition for figuring out what you actually want. 2 days after that conversation, Charlie came in from town with news that had the quality of something arriving faster than expected. He found Amelia and Wyatt both in the kitchen. Wyatt had come in for his midday coffee, which he took standing at the counter, and Amelia was in the middle of bread dough, which was not a thing you could easily pause. And he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man delivering weather that is going to inconvenience everyone. Fitch filed with the land office, Charlie said. Formal boundary claim. Dawson's nephew works the counter over there, and he said it came in day before yesterday. Wyatt set his coffee cup down. There's more, Charlie said. The claim cites... He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, clearly something he'd written down carefully to get it right. It cites negligent maintenance of property records over a period of 2 or more years as contributing evidence of disputed occupancy. He looked up. Whatever that means. It means he used the supply account discrepancy, Amelia said. Her hands had gone still in the dough. He filed before we could clean up the records. Pell, Wyatt said. I'll get the documents, Amelia said. She pulled her hands out of the dough and wiped them on her apron and went to the supply ledger without being asked. The separate sheet she'd written, dates, amounts, the witness account Pell had requested, was where she'd left it. She retrieved it and the Keswick letter both and was back in 30 seconds. Wyatt was already putting on his jacket. I'll come, she said. He stopped, looked at her. The document has my signature on it, she said. If Pell needs to present it, I should be there to confirm it. It'll mean being in the same building as Fitch, most likely, he said. It wasn't a warning exactly, more an offering of information so she could make her own decision. I've been in the same building as Fitch before, she said. I managed. He nodded once. Pete, he called toward the back of the house. Can you watch the boy? Pete's voice came from somewhere. Boy's already watching me, has been all morning. Eli, from even further away, Frank ate again. He did, Pete confirmed in the same tone Wyatt had used that very first time, months ago now. He certainly did. Amelia looked at Wyatt. He was looking at her with something in his face that was somewhere between a smile and something more serious than a smile. The expression of a man who is watching his life shift in a direction he hadn't planned on and finding that he doesn't want to correct it. Let's go, she said. She had the documents in one hand and her decent coat in the other, and she walked out of the kitchen toward whatever came next with the particular purposeful stride of someone who had already been through the worst version of this and was still standing. The ranch stretched around them in every direction. The fence lines, the pasture, the barn where Eli was currently conducting another official inspection of horses. All of it earned, all of it under threat, all of it worth fighting for. Amelia had arrived here as a failed arrangement, a woman nobody had come to claim. She was leaving this particular morning as a witness, as someone whose account of events was considered worth having. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the beginning of something that neither of them had managed to name yet, but that both of them, in the honest part of themselves, already knew was there. The horses were saddled. The road to town stretched flat and certain ahead of them. She rode. Horace Pell's office smelled the same as it had the first time Amelia visited. Pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where windows don't get opened often enough. He was at his desk when they arrived, and he looked up at both of them with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit, but had hoped it would come at a more convenient time. Sit down, he said, and they did, and Amelia put the documents on the desk between them the way she'd learned to do things, directly, without preamble, letting the material speak before the explanation. Pell read through the witness account first. He read slowly, which she had decided was one of his better qualities. Then he read the Keswick letter. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man doing arithmetic in his head. When did Fitch file? Wyatt asked. Day before yesterday, Pell said. I received notice this morning. The formal hearing before the county land commissioner is set for 6 weeks from Thursday. He tapped the witness account with one finger. This is good. The detail is good, and the timeline is clear. The Keswick letter is better. It establishes intent rather than just error. He looked at Amelia. You found both of these in the course of routine record keeping. Yes, she said. And you can testify to that under oath. Yes. Pell nodded slowly. Fitch's claim rests on 2 pillars. The survey ambiguity, which is real and which I won't pretend otherwise, and the record negligence argument, which this... He tapped the document again, largely dismantles. If we can show that the discrepancies were introduced by a third party in Fitch's employ, rather than originating from Cole's management, the negligence argument collapses. Can we show that? Wyatt asked. We can make a strong case for it. Whether that's the same thing depends on the commissioner. Pell picked up the Keswick letter and held it toward the window light. This letter is addressed to Rudd, who is your supply manager, and it references information about the state of your property records. The question is whether Rudd can be located and whether he'd be willing to say anything useful. He left in March, Wyatt said. No forwarding information. People leave tracks even when they don't intend to, Pell said. He set the letter down. I'll make some inquiries. In the meantime, I want the full account of every entry in that ledger from January onward, with your notes on each anomaly, Mrs. Rose. Not because I doubt what's here, because I want it to be exhaustive. When Fitch's lawyer argues, I want there to be no version of the record I haven't already accounted for. Amelia nodded. I can have it done in 3 days. Pell looked at her with the expression of a man revising something. You did this work in your head before you wrote any of it down? I keep a running ledger, she said, in my head and on paper. It's how I've always managed accounts. Where did you learn accounts? My father kept books for 3 businesses in Philadelphia. I helped him from the time I was 12. She said it without apology and without elaboration, because it was simply true, and the time for being modest about useful things had passed. Pell looked at Wyatt briefly, something passing between them that she couldn't entirely read, though she had a suspicion, and then looked back at his own papers. 3 days then, and Cole, I need you to provide a complete ownership history of the eastern boundary line. Every deed transfer, every survey, going back as far as you have records. I have the original purchase documents, Wyatt said. The survey from when I bought the land. Bring them. All of them. They rode back in the late afternoon with the sun low and flat across the prairie, turning everything the particular amber that made the Kansas plains look more beautiful than they had any right to from ground level. Neither of them spoke much for the first mile. The horses moved at an easy pace, and Amelia used the quiet to begin organizing the ledger work in her head. The sequence, the notation format, what Pell would need to be able to follow her reasoning without her in the room. He looked at you differently by the end, Wyatt said at some point. She glanced over. Pell? When you said about your father's books, he revised something. People often do, she said, when they find out a woman can actually do a thing rather than approximately do it. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. It used to bother me more than it does now. I've gotten pragmatic about it. If being underestimated means I have room to work before people decide to interfere, I'll take it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's a harder way to live than it should be. Yes, she said simply. It is. They rode the rest of the way without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silences between people become comfortable when they've spent enough time together to stop filling them out of nervousness. The 3 days of ledger work were the most concentrated effort she'd put into anything since arriving in Kansas, including the first weeks of establishing herself at Martha Greer's boarding house. She worked at the kitchen table after the supper dishes were cleared, with Eli asleep and the lamp turned up, and the ledger and her notes spread around her in the organized chaos of someone who knows exactly where everything is, even when it doesn't look that way to an outside observer. Pete brought her coffee without being asked, which was how Pete expressed concern, through practical gestures that required no acknowledgement. The second evening, he set a plate of cornbread beside her elbow and said, "You eat when you're working or you forget," which was accurate, and she didn't argue with it. Charlie sat on the porch those evenings, whittling something that may or may not have been developing into a discernible shape, present without being intrusive in the way that Charlie managed most things. Wyatt worked at his own desk in the side office, pulling out the deed documents Pell had requested, sorting through the paper history of a land purchase he'd made 9 years ago with the straightforward optimism of a younger man who had not yet learned that the frontier had more ways to take things from you than the obvious ones. On the second evening, he brought her a question, a date discrepancy in the original survey document versus a referenced deed amendment, and they sat together at the kitchen table for 2 hours working through it with the original documents and her ledger notes side by side, talking in the quiet, focused shorthand of people who are thinking about the same problem from different angles. It was the most purely functional thing they had done together, and also somehow one of the more revealing, because watching someone think through something difficult tells you things about them that regular conversation doesn't. Wyatt thought carefully and hated getting things wrong and would say, "I don't know," without apparent discomfort, when he didn't know, which was rarer than it should have been in a man in his position. She noticed all of these things and filed them in the same place she'd been filing everything else about him over the last 2 months. The growing account of someone she was coming to understand accurately rather than through the distortion of need or hope. That was the difference, she thought. Gerald Fitch she had understood through the distortion of need. She'd read his letters looking for what she wanted to find, and had found it because she was looking hard enough. Wyatt Cole she was coming to understand in the ordinary friction of daily life, which was slower and less romantic and considerably more reliable. She delivered the completed document to Pell on the morning of the third day. He read through the first several pages while she sat across from him and watched his face, and what she saw there satisfied her, the expression of a man finding the work sound. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be." "There's one thing I want to add," he said, "a formal statement of your professional capacity, that you have training in accounts management, that this work was performed in your professional rather than personal capacity. It'll carry more weight in front of the commissioner." "I'm not a professional accountant," she said. "I haven't been formally employed as one." "You've kept accounts for—" He looked at his notes. "A household, your father's clients, and now a working ranch, over a span of approximately 14 years, with measurable accuracy." He looked at her over his papers. "That is, in practical terms, professional experience. The frontier doesn't require credentials, Mrs. Rose. It requires demonstrated competence, which you have." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Good." He made a note. "I'll add the statement. You'll need to sign it." She signed it. Walking back to where she'd tied the horse, she turned that conversation over in her mind. 14 years, Pell had said, as though it were a resume. She had spent 14 years keeping accounts as an ancillary activity, something she did in addition to everything else, something that didn't count because it was performed in domestic rather than commercial settings. Pell had looked at the same 14 years and called it professional experience without any apparent sense that this was a generous interpretation. Maybe it wasn't a generous interpretation. Maybe it was just an accurate one, and she was the one who'd been misreading it. She untied the horse and rode back to the ranch, and did not resolve that thought entirely, but kept it somewhere accessible. The trouble, when it came, arrived in a form she hadn't anticipated. It was a Sunday, 4 weeks before the commissioner's hearing, and she had taken Eli into town for the simple reason that he'd been cooped up at the ranch for most of the week due to weather, and was developing the particular frantic energy of a 2-year-old who needs to move through a wider world than a farmyard. They walked the main street, which Eli treated as a landscape of inexhaustible interest, stopping at every hitching post and stepping carefully over every gap in the boardwalk with the focused gravity of a small person navigating significant terrain. They were outside Dawson's store when a man she didn't recognize came up beside her and said, in the conversational tone of someone offering weather commentary, "You're the woman staying out at Cole's place." She looked at him. He was somewhere in his 40s, well-dressed by frontier standards. Not a rancher, or not only a rancher. Something in the cut of his coat said he was accustomed to being in rooms where decisions got made. "I work at Cole's ranch," she said. "Yes." "My name is Hadley," he said. "I represent Mr. Fitch in certain business matters." She went very still on the inside while keeping her face neutral. Eli had found a fascinating crack in the boardwalk and was crouching to inspect it with both hands on his knees. "I'm not sure why that's relevant to me," she said. "Mr. Fitch is concerned," Hadley said, with the smoothness of a man who practiced these conversations, "that the upcoming land hearing has gotten more complicated than it needs to be. He's a reasonable man. He'd prefer to find a resolution that doesn't require the expense and uncertainty of a formal proceeding." "That's an interesting thing to raise with me," she said, "rather than with Cole's attorney. We've been in touch with Mr. Pell. He's been—" A pause that contained a judgment. Thorough. Mr. Fitch felt a different kind of conversation might be productive. She looked at him steadily. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where we acknowledge that certain documents that have recently entered the record might be reviewed for accuracy." "You're asking me to reconsider my witness account," she said. "I'm asking whether you're entirely certain of everything in it." He smiled, and the smile was practiced and not warm. "Records work involves interpretation. There's often more than one way to read a set of figures." "There is," she agreed. "I read these figures 17 different ways before I wrote the account. The interpretation I put in writing was the only one consistent with all of the evidence." She looked at Eli, who had moved on from the crack and was now examining a knot in the wooden post with the same thoroughness. "Mr. Hadley, if Mr. Fitch wants to challenge the accuracy of my account, He's welcome to do so at the hearing, where I'll be there to explain my methodology to the commissioner. That's the appropriate venue. She picked Eli up. We're done. Mrs. Rose. His voice had the edge of something under the smoothness now. Not quite a threat, but in the adjacent neighborhood. You've had a difficult few months. New circumstances, uncertain future. It would be a shame if complications arose. She turned and looked at him one more time, and she took her time about it, enough time that it became its own kind of statement. My future has been uncertain since I got off that train, she said. I've been managing. She walked away. She walked the full block to where her horse was tied before she let out a breath that had apparently been waiting to be released for the last several minutes. Her hands, when she looked at them, were entirely steady. She was genuinely surprised by that. Mama, Eli said, from her hip, in the tone of someone who has an important report to file. Yes? Post, he said, with a hole. I saw it, she said. Very interesting hole. She rode straight back to the ranch and told Wyatt everything before she'd even taken her coat off, standing in the front hallway with Eli on her hip and speaking in the same even, sequential way she'd told him about Fitch's first visit to the porch. Facts, in order, without editorial, because the facts were alarming enough without elaboration. Wyatt listened with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that was past the working through it stage and into something colder and more resolved. Hadley, he said when she finished. He's a land lawyer out of Wichita. Fitch uses him for anything he doesn't want attached directly to his own name. He came to me specifically, she said. Not to Pell, not to you. Because he figured you were the weakest point, Wyatt said. You're not from here. You arrived in bad circumstances. He thought you might be persuaded to protect yourself at the expense of the record. He was wrong about my priorities, she said. I know that, he said. And then, after a moment, I'm sorry he approached you. That was a deliberate choice to make you feel isolated. I noticed, she said dryly. Did it work? She looked at him. I'm here, aren't I? Telling you about it. Something in his face shifted. That same movement she'd seen a handful of times now. The expression that was somewhere between a man acknowledging a practical truth and a man responding to something that had nothing to do with practicality. He uncrossed his arms. I'll send word to Pell tonight, he said. The approach to a witness needs to be in the record before Fitch's people decide to deny it happened. I thought you'd say that, she said. I already wrote down what Hadley said, the exact words, as close as I could get them. She pulled the folded paper from her coat pocket. While I was writing back. He took the paper from her, and when his hand closed around it, their fingers were close enough that the transfer was a near thing, and she felt the warmth of that proximity with a clarity that she couldn't attribute to anything except exactly what it was. She stepped back slightly and went to hang her coat. Amelia, yeah, he said. She turned. He was holding the paper. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at something and isn't sure if this is the right moment to say it. The particular tension of someone who has been thinking carefully for a long time and is tired of the thinking. Thank you, he said finally. It wasn't what he'd started to say. She was fairly certain of that, but she also recognized the decision to pull back from the edge of something because she'd been making that same decision herself for weeks. Of course, she said, and went to start supper. Pell documented the witness approach. The account of Hadley's conversation joined the growing file of material that Pell was assembling with the focused satisfaction of a man who enjoys building an airtight case, which was, Amelia had decided, exactly the quality you wanted in an attorney when the situation was what theirs was. The weeks between that Sunday and the commissioner's hearing were the strangest of her time on the ranch. Strange because everything was simultaneously ordinary and loaded. The daily work continued: cooking, records, supply runs, Eli's education in the management of horses, and the feeding habits of barn cats, and the apparently fascinating engineering of fence post placement that Pete had begun explaining to him in small person terms. The ordinary texture of a working household. Beneath it, always, the awareness of the hearing approaching, of Fitch's next move being a question that hadn't yet been answered. And beneath that, the other thing. The thing that neither of them had been ready to say, and that was getting increasingly difficult to keep in the peripheral vision where she'd been storing it. It was Pete who forced the issue, indirectly and entirely by accident, the way Pete did most things. He had been in the kitchen one evening. Amelia was washing up. Wyatt was at the other end of the table with the deed documents again. And Pete was ostensibly there for a second cup of coffee, but had been standing for long enough that Amelia had already noticed he had something to say. "The boy called you something today," Pete said to Wyatt. Wyatt looked up from the documents. "We were in the barn. He was telling Frank about his day, the way he does." Pete poured his coffee with great deliberateness. He said, "And then my dad showed me where the water pump was." The kitchen went very quiet. Wyatt was still. Amelia had stopped moving at the sink. "Figured you should know," Pete said. He picked up his cup and went back out to the bunkhouse with the air of a man who has done his part and is leaving the rest of it to people better equipped to handle it. The silence after the door closed was the kind that requires both people in a room to decide at the same time how to handle it, which meant it lasted a moment longer than usual. "He's two," Amelia said finally, still not turning from the sink. "He's been watching you with the horses every morning. It was probably—" "I know what it probably was," Wyatt said. He was quiet for a moment. "Did it—" He stopped, started again. "Was that all right? For you to hear that?" She turned around then. He was looking at her directly, with none of the careful management that he usually brought to conversations that were edging toward something neither of them had named yet. Just the question, plain and unguarded. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "It was harder than I expected," she said, "but not in the way you might think. Not because it was wrong." He held her gaze. "Then in what way?" "Because—" She looked at the wall beside him, finding the words. "Because I came here not wanting Eli to attach to something that wasn't permanent. And somewhere in the last 2 months, I stopped being sure what was temporary and what wasn't. And when Pete said that, I realized I had stopped guarding against it, him attaching, and that—" She looked back at Wyatt. "That scared me. Because the last time I stopped guarding against something, I was standing on a train platform." Wyatt stood up from the table slowly, the way he did most things, with a deliberateness that was never stiff, just considered. He came around to her side of the table and stopped about 3 feet away, which was close enough to be direct and far enough to not be crowding, and he said, "I'm not Fitch." "I know that," she said. "I have known that for a long time. Knowing it and trusting it aren't the same step." "No," he agreed. "They're not." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that was so different from the careful, controlled version he usually presented to the world. "I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give," he said. "I'm not asking for anything right now at all. I just—" He stopped. "I want you to know that what Eli called me wasn't unwelcome, and that you and him being here isn't something I'm waiting out." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the table threw its warm, unsteady light across the kitchen. Outside, the plains wind was doing what it always did. Steady, indifferent, enormous. "All right," she said. Her voice wasn't entirely steady. "All right," he said. He didn't move toward her. She didn't move toward him. They stood in the kitchen in the lamplight with that fragile, serious, entirely unhurried understanding between them, and that was enough for now. More than enough. More than either of them had honestly expected to be standing in reach of when the year started. The night before the commissioner's hearing, a storm rolled in from the northwest. It arrived with the particular announcement of bad Great Plains weather, a green-yellow light in the late afternoon sky that Pete looked at and said, in the tone of someone reading a known text, "That's going to be bad," and was right. By 8 in the evening, the wind was up hard, and by 10, the rain was horizontal, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours. And the barometric thing that Pete measured with an old instrument on the barn wall had done something Pete said he'd only seen twice before and didn't like the looks of. Wyatt spent 2 hours in the storm securing things. Equipment, the barn doors, a section of fence near the east pasture that had been on his list of things to fix and had now moved urgently to the top. Charlie went with him. Pete stayed with Amelia and Eli, and when the storm intensified past a certain point and Eli woke from the noise and the cold drafts coming under the front door and started to cry, with the bewildered, frightened crying of a child, woken by something too big to understand, Pete sat on the edge of the small bed and told Eli about a storm he'd ridden out 30 years ago in Texas that had been at least twice as loud as this one, in a voice so calm and matter-of-fact that Eli was asleep again before Pete got to the part where the barn roof had become temporarily located in a field 200 yards away. Amelia sat by the window watching for the lantern light that would mean Wyatt was coming back. The storm moved through in waves, loud, then briefly less loud, then loud again, and she kept her breathing even and her hands occupied with the mending basket she'd brought from the main room, sewing in inadequate lamplight with less accuracy than usual and not caring about that right now. The lantern appeared at 11:30. She had the door open before he knocked. He was soaked through entirely. His hat had apparently lost an argument with the wind somewhere, his jacket was plastered flat, and he was muddy from the knees down. He stepped in and stood there dripping on the entry floor with the sheepish, tired look of a man who knows he is currently presenting a poor case for himself. "Bent's is down," he said. "East section. It's going to need 2 days of work." "I know," she said. "I saw the light from the window." She handed him the dry towel she'd brought from the kitchen for this exact eventuality. He looked at the towel and then at her with an expression that was too worn out to be anything except what it was, straightforwardly grateful. He took the towel and rubbed his face with it. "Hearing's in the morning," he said, muffled by the towel. "I know. Pete's already said he'll sit with Eli." He lowered the towel and looked at her. "You ready for it?" She thought about the witness account, the ledger documentation, the statement of professional capacity. She thought about Hadley on the boardwalk and the way she'd walked away from him. She thought about standing in front of a land commissioner she'd never met and saying plainly what she'd found and how she'd found it and why she was certain of it, in a room that would contain Gerald Fitch and his Wichita lawyer, and probably several other people who had various reasons to hope she would get things wrong. "No," she said honestly, "but I'll do it anyway." Wyatt looked at her with something in his face that she had given up trying to describe to herself in neutral terms. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it works." "Go dry off," she said. "We need to leave by 7. He went. She stood in the entry for a moment in the aftermath of the storm. The wind still going, the rain still falling, but the worst of it through, and put her hand flat against the wall of the house that had not been hers when she arrived, and that she had, without making a conscious decision about it, stopped thinking of as not hers. Tomorrow there would be a hearing. There would be a commissioner and a disputed boundary and 40 acres of land and a man who had sent a boy with a note, and all of the documented evidence of what he'd tried to do laid out in Horace Pell's careful legal presentation. There would be Amelia's own voice, saying plainly what she'd found. She didn't know how it would go. She had never known how things would go. She had arrived in this town with nothing except a child and 43 cents and the particular stubbornness of someone who has run out of the option of giving up. And she had built something here out of ordinary work and honest attention. And tomorrow she would stand in a room and defend it. That was, she thought, exactly the kind of thing she had come to the frontier for. Not the version she'd imagined from Philadelphia, in someone else's house under someone else's name. This version. The one she'd built herself piece by piece out of whatever was available. She went to check on Eli, who was asleep in Pete's calm, and then to her own room, and lay down in the dark and let the sound of the diminishing storm carry her toward whatever came next. They left at 7, as she'd said they would. The storm had cleared itself out sometime before dawn, leaving behind the particular washed clarity that follows hard weather on the plains. The air thin and bright, the ground dark with moisture, every fence post and barn board standing out with the sharp definition of things newly rinsed. It would have been a beautiful morning under different circumstances. As it was, Amelia noticed it the way you notice things when your mind is occupied elsewhere, peripherally, without full attention. Wyatt had found a dry hat. His jacket was still slightly damp at the collar. He rode with the straight-backed quiet of a man who has made his decisions and is done deliberating, which she had come to recognize as the version of him that was, paradoxically, the easiest to be around, resolved. Wyatt was calmer than thinking it through Wyatt, and calmer was useful this morning. She rode beside him and went through the witness account in her head for what was probably the 14th time, not because she doubted it, but because the particular anxiety of the morning required something productive to do with itself, and reviewing what she knew to be accurate was better than reviewing what she didn't know and couldn't control. Pell met them outside the county land office, a low brick building on the east side of Caldwell's Main Street that functioned as the administrative center for everything from deed registration to the commissioner's periodic hearings. He was carrying a leather satchel that looked substantially heavier than it had at their last meeting. "Good," he said when he saw them. "You're early. That's good." He looked at Amelia. "How are you?" "Fine," she said. "You don't need to be fine," he said. "You need to be accurate. Those are different things." "I know," she said. "I'm both." He almost smiled. "Good. Come inside." Fitch was already there. She saw him as they came through the door. He was at the far end of the room with Hadley beside him, both of them in the attitude of men conducting a private conference, which they stopped conducting when the door opened. Fitch looked at Wyatt first, then at Amelia, and his expression did something complicated and brief that she filed away without reaction. Hadley looked at her with the smooth blankness of a man who has decided that the boardwalk conversation 3 weeks ago did not happen, which was a choice she found more interesting than threatening. The room had a long table, a raised platform at one end where the commissioner would sit, and several chairs arranged along the sides for observers. There were, she noted with mild surprise, more observers than she'd expected. 8 or 10 people she recognized from town, including Martha Greer, who was sitting in the second row with her iron posture and her hands folded in her lap, and who gave Amelia a nod of the kind that contains a considerable amount of information in a very compressed form. Dawson was there, 2 of the other ranchers whose names she'd learned over the last months. A woman she didn't recognize who was taking notes in a small book and who had the focused, purposeful look of someone being paid to be there. A newspaper correspondent, she guessed, from Wichita or somewhere else that covered county proceedings. She hadn't expected witnesses. She hadn't expected the room to be a room that people felt was worth attending. "Did you know they'd be here?" she asked Pell quietly. "I may have mentioned to a few people that the hearing concerned an attempt to use fraudulent supply records to support a boundary claim against a working rancher," Pell said, with the precise blandness of a man who is very aware of what he just said. "People in this county have land. They tend to be interested in how land disputes are handled." She looked at him. "That was deliberate." "I am a lawyer," he said. "Being deliberate is the job." The commissioner arrived at 8:15, a man named Aldous Crane, somewhere in his late 50s, with the build of someone who had done physical labor earlier in his life, and the manner of someone who had spent the subsequent decades in rooms where he was the person who decided things. He settled himself at the raised platform, arranged his papers, and looked out at the room with the air of a man who has presided over enough of these to have strong opinions about how they should go, and equally strong opinions about how they usually went instead. "We're here on the matter of Fitch versus Cole," he said, regarding a disputed boundary line in the eastern section of the Caldwell County Land Registry. He looked at both tables. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings. I want to hear the evidence, not the arguments. Arguments come after. Mr. Pell, you're responding to the claim. You'll present first." Pell stood. What followed was the most concentrated 2 hours of Amelia's life, which was a competition with some significant prior entries. Pell was good. She had suspected he was good, and watching him work confirmed it. He presented the material in the sequence she recognized from their conversations, but assembled now into a structure that had a different quality from the individual pieces. The supply ledger anomalies, the pattern of their occurrence, the Keswick letter, which he read aloud in full in a room that went notably quiet during it, the supply orders for fence posts to unspecified locations, and then, with the precision of someone who has been building toward this, her witness account, the dates, the methodology, the alternative explanations she'd considered, and why they didn't hold. He did not make it dramatic. He made it clear, which turned out to be more effective. When Crane asked who had prepared the witness account, Pell said, "Mrs. Amelia Rose, who manages accounts for the Cole Ranch and who is present today." Crane looked at her. "You found these discrepancies in the course of routine record keeping?" "Yes," she said. "How long did it take you to identify the pattern?" "I noticed the first anomaly on my 3rd week. I spent approximately 2 weeks verifying it before I said anything." "Why 2 weeks?" "Because I wanted to be certain before I accused an absent man's work of being deliberately fraudulent," she said. "It seemed like the right standard." Crane looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, then made a note and looked back at Pell. Hadley's presentation of Fitch's case was smooth and well-prepared, which she'd expected. The survey ambiguity was real, and he made the most of it. 20 years of legal uncertainty over a 40-acre boundary had produced enough conflicting paperwork to construct a reasonable-sounding argument, and Hadley was good enough at his job to construct it. He addressed the supply record issue by characterizing it as a matter of clerical inconsistency rather than fraud. The word interpretation featured heavily, which made the back of Amelia's neck prickle, and suggested that Mrs. Rose's account, however well-intentioned, represented one possible reading of ambiguous figures rather than a definitive conclusion. He was almost convincing. She sat and listened to him, almost convinced the room, and kept her hands still in her lap and waited. Crane called her to the platform directly after Hadley's presentation. Not Wyatt, not Pell, her. She stood at the platform and looked at the commissioner and answered his questions in the same even, sequential way she'd been answering questions for 3 months now. Precisely, without elaboration, without the verbal flinching that happened when people were less certain than they were trying to appear. Mrs. Rose, Crane said, Mr. Fitch's representative characterizes the supply record discrepancies as potentially resulting from clerical error rather than deliberate manipulation. What is your response to that? A clerical error would affect individual entries, she said. What I found was a pattern. The anomalies appear consistently in the same category of purchase, at the same phase of each month's ordering cycle, with the same documentation gap, the missing delivery location, throughout the period when Mr. Rudd was managing supply orders and in no other period. A clerical error is random. This wasn't random. You're certain of that? I'm certain of the pattern. The interpretation of intent I've offered is the most consistent with the evidence, but I've noted in the account that it is an interpretation. What is not an interpretation is the documentary record itself. Crane looked at her for a long moment. You've done account work before this employment. For 14 years. Household accounts, my father's client accounts, and for the last 3 months, the coal ranch. No formal credential. No formal credential, she agreed. 14 years of accurate accounts. He made another note. Then he said, the Keswick letter. You found it in the supply correspondence files. Yes. Filed between 2 supply invoices from the same period. It may have been misfiled. It may have been retained deliberately. I don't know which. But you kept it. It referenced the coal property records by name and was addressed to the ranch's supply manager from a man employed by the adjoining property, she said. Keeping it seemed prudent. Something crossed Crane's face, not quite amusement, but in the direction of respect. You can step down, Mrs. Rose. She stepped down and went back to her seat and sat with her hands in her lap and her breathing steady, and did not look at Fitch. Pell caught her eye briefly and gave the smallest nod. Crane took 40 minutes to deliberate, which he did alone in a back office while the room conducted the subdued, tentative conversation of people who are waiting on a result they care about and have agreed not to predict out loud. Fitch sat at his table with Hadley and spoke quietly. He did not look relaxed. Amelia noticed this and found it more informative than anything else in the room. Wyatt sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Pete had once said that Wyatt's particular quality was that he understood when a situation required action and when it required endurance, and he didn't confuse the two. She could see that now. The stillness was not passive, it was a form of discipline, the same discipline that had kept him on a ranch alone for 4 years after losing everything that had made the ranch worth coming home to. She thought about Sarah, who she'd never met, who had come from Missouri and hadn't gone back, who had died in the summer of 1878 with a 4-year-old daughter in the same week, in a house that had then stood quiet and half-maintained for 4 years, while the man who loved them worked around the shape of their absence. She thought about Eli calling Wyatt his dad while talking to a horse, in the serious reportorial way that small children communicate the things they've decided are simply true. She thought about a 14-year-old boy handing her a folded note on a train platform, and the 43 cents, and the bench, and the particular quality of the afternoon light when you realize that the future you built toward doesn't exist. None of these things had led where she expected. All of them had led here, to this room, to this seat, to a witness account with her signature on it that was sitting in Horace Pell's leather satchel, and might be the thing that determined whether a good man kept his land. She had not saved herself by waiting for someone to save her. She had done it the only way that actually works, by getting up from the bench and then walking again, and then again, with no particular certainty about where it was leading, only the commitment to keep moving rather than stay still. That was the thing nobody put in letters. The matrimonial agency's correspondents had spoken of security and domestic partnership and a fresh start. What the frontier actually offered was harder and more honest than any of that. It offered the chance to find out what you were made of when the comfortable options ran out. Some people found out they couldn't manage it. Amelia had found out that she could manage considerably more than she'd been given credit for, by others and by herself. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a comfort or an indictment of the 26 years preceding it. Maybe both. Crane came back at 11:20. The room went quiet with the immediate completeness of a room that has been waiting for something. He settled himself at the platform, arranged his papers, and looked out at the assembled faces with the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion and is about to deliver it with or without anyone's approval. The boundary dispute, he said, represents a genuine ambiguity in the original 1863 survey. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. However, the applicable standard in cases of survey ambiguity is continuous and uncontested occupation, which in this instance favors the Cole property. The eastern boundary as maintained by the Cole Ranch has been consistent and undisputed for the 9 years of Mr. Cole's ownership, and the 20 years prior to that under the previous owner. Fitch's posture at the other table had changed. Slightly, but Amelia saw it. The negligent management claim, Crane continued, is not supported by the evidence as presented. The supply record discrepancies cited in the original filing have been shown to originate during a specific and limited period associated with a single employee, and the documentary evidence presented today, specifically the Keswick correspondence and the account prepared by Mrs. Rose, establishes that these discrepancies were introduced externally rather than arising from management failure. He paused. I'll note for the record that the attempt to use those discrepancies as supporting evidence for this claim, when the originating party had reason to know of their external source, is a matter I'm referring to the county attorney's office for review. The room was very quiet. The boundary claim is denied, Crane said. The Cole property boundaries stand as recorded in the original deed. This matter is closed. He gathered his papers. Mr. Pell, I'd like a copy of the Rose account for the county file. He stood and left the platform. The room broke into sound, shut. Not loud, not celebratory, but the released breath quality of people who have been holding something and are now setting it down. Amelia sat very still for a moment. Beside her, Wyatt let out a slow breath. She felt it more than heard it. A physical release, the kind that comes from something you've been carrying finally, actually, being set down. Well, he said. Yes, she said. Pell appeared at Wyatt's shoulder with the expression of a man containing significant professional satisfaction behind a professionally neutral face. I'll need to file several things this afternoon. You can go. Wyatt stood. Amelia stood. Across the room, Fitch was speaking to Hadley in a low, tight voice that carried nothing coherent but communicated everything necessary about how this felt from that side of the table. He didn't look at them as they moved toward the door. She noticed this and filed it under useful information. A man who can't meet your eyes after losing has more fight left in him than one who does, because he's still angry rather than resigned. She mentioned this to Wyatt as they came out into the bright morning. He looked at her. You think he's not done? I think he'll be careful for a while, she said. The county attorney referral matters to him. Hadley will tell him to let this settle, but... She paused. He's a man who doesn't like being made to look like he lost. And he lost in front of witnesses. What would you do? Wyatt asked. In his position, she thought about it honestly. I'd wait, she said. I'd find something smaller and less visible, and I'd be patient about it. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then we keep the records clean, he said, and we pay attention. Yes, she said, we do. They walked toward where the horses were tied, and the morning was still that washed, clear quality from the post-storm light, and Martha Greer came out of the building behind them and said, without ceremony, good result, and kept walking, which for Martha was a standing ovation. 2 weeks after the hearing, Pell sent word that the county attorney's office had opened a formal inquiry into the boundary claim filing and the conduct associated with it. He sent it in a letter to Wyatt, but addressed the final paragraph to Amelia directly, something she suspected he hadn't initially planned and had decided was appropriate anyway. It said, the account you prepared was the linchpin of this matter. I want that on record. She read it in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning and put it in the supply ledger where she kept things that mattered, between the pages she'd use next time she needed to find something important in a hurry. The autumn moved into itself steadily, the way seasons do on the plains, not the dramatic color change of the eastern states she'd come from, but a gradual cooling and browning, the grass going from late summer gold to something older and quieter, the sky dropping lower and closer. The days got shorter. The mornings got cold enough that Eli started appearing at the kitchen door in the early hours wearing both his own socks and what appeared to be one of Pete's, which Pete claimed not to notice and Eli claimed to have needed. The fence line that the storm had taken down had been rebuilt. 2 hard days of work in the week after the hearing, Wyatt and Charlie, and eventually Amelia herself on the 3rd day, when it became clear it was going to take longer than estimated, and she was not willing to stand in the kitchen while the work backed up. She had no particular skill with fence posts at the start of that 3rd day, and a functional competence with them by the end, which Pete watched with the approving expression of someone witnessing the natural order of things asserting itself. "You're useful," Pete told her, in the barn that evening, in the tone of someone conferring a significant honor. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "Wasn't a compliment exactly," he said. "It was an observation." "I know," she said. "I prefer observations." He nodded, satisfied. Wyatt asked her to marry him in October. He did not do it dramatically, or at the kitchen table in the lamplight where so many of their important conversations had happened, or on a fine afternoon with the light arranged to advantage. He did it in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon, where they had both ended up at the same time for different reasons. She'd come to find Eli, who had migrated in the direction of Franklin's stall, as he usually did in the late afternoon, and Wyatt had come to check on a mare who'd been favoring one leg since the day before. Eli was sitting in the straw of Franklin's stall, with the horse standing over him with the enormous, patient tolerance of an old animal who has decided this particular small person is acceptable. And Amelia was leaning on the stall door watching this, and Wyatt came up beside her and stood there for a moment looking at the same thing. Then he said, "I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him. "If you said no," he said, "or if you said you needed more time, that would be all right. I want to say that first." She waited. "I'd like you to marry me," he said, "not because of the ranch or the records or because it would simplify the arrangement, because—" He stopped, looked at Eli, then back at her. "Because this is what I want. You and him. This specific thing, here. I want it to be permanent." She looked at him for a long time. He stood there and let her look. Didn't shift or qualify or fill the silence with anything. Just met her eyes with the steady, undefended expression that she'd been watching him learn to offer her over the last 4 months. She thought about the matrimonial agency's letter with its language about fresh starts and domestic partnership. She thought about Gerald Fitch's 4 sentences on a folded note, unsigned. She thought about what it meant to be asked by a person who meant it, for the thing itself rather than its utility. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I keep my own counsel. I form opinions without asking permission. I have a child who will follow you around for the rest of your life if you let him. And I am not interested in the kind of marriage where I manage the house, and you manage the land, and we are polite to each other about the respective territories." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm serious, Wyatt." "So am I," he said. "I'm not asking for a housekeeper with a legal status. I know the difference." He looked at her directly. "I've watched you think your way through a land fraud case, face down a man who tried to bribe your testimony, rebuild fence posts in the cold, and run a household while doing all of it. I'm not asking you to be less than any of that. I'm asking you to do all of it here, with me, as the permanent arrangement rather than the temporary one." She looked at Eli, who had fallen asleep in the straw. Franklin was standing over him with the patient immovability of a horse who has decided this is now his responsibility and intends to take it seriously. The barn was warm with the particular warmth of large animals and old wood, and outside the afternoon light was going toward that amber quality she'd been watching all autumn. And somewhere behind her the house stood on the land that they had gone to a hearing to defend, and the land was still here, and so was she. "Yes," she said. Wyatt closed his eyes briefly, and she saw in that brief moment something that he didn't usually let be visible, the full weight of what he'd been carrying and the specific sensation of some of it being set down. Then he opened his eyes, and he was just Wyatt again, standing in his barn on a Tuesday afternoon. "All right," he said. "Good." "Good," she agreed. Eli woke up at that moment, looked around at his surroundings with the mild surprise of someone who had not expected to fall asleep in a barn, saw his mother and Wyatt standing at the stall door, and said, with the directness of a child who does not overthink these things, "Frank kept me warm." "He did," Wyatt confirmed. "Good horse," Eli said, and patted Franklin's leg, and Franklin accepted this assessment with dignity. Amelia looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Amelia. Neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying right then, and they both knew it. They married in December at the courthouse in Caldwell, in a ceremony that took 11 minutes and was witnessed by Pete, Charlie, Martha Greer, Horace Pell, and Eli, who wore his repaired hat and stood with the gravity of someone fulfilling an important official function. It was not romantic in any of the conventional senses. The courthouse was cold, the clerk who performed the ceremony had a head cold and kept apologizing for it, and Pete cried in the particular way of large old men who are unexpectedly undone by things they had apparently been hoping for, briefly, thoroughly, and with enormous personal embarrassment at being noticed doing it. Charlie handed him a handkerchief with the air of someone who had been prepared for this eventuality and was not surprised. Martha Greer said, afterward, on the courthouse steps in the December cold, "About time," which covered everything she had to say on the subject. Horace Pell shook Wyatt's hand and then turned to Amelia and shook hers, which in 1882 was a more deliberate gesture than it might have appeared, and which she received as it was intended. The county attorney's inquiry into Fitch's conduct concluded in January. Hadley negotiated an arrangement that involved Fitch paying a substantial fine for the fraudulent filing and formally withdrawing any claim to the 40 acres. It was not a trial. It was not a public reckoning of the kind that would have felt, in some satisfying story, like justice fully administered. It was a fine and a withdrawal, and Fitch going back to his property with his reputation dented but not destroyed, which was the version of accountability that the frontier mostly offered, partial, unglamorous, better than nothing. Wyatt accepted it with the equanimity of a man who has stopped expecting the world to provide the clean resolutions it rarely delivers. Amelia accepted it with the same equanimity for the same reason, and also because she had learned that the version of justice that actually arrives, however imperfect, requires more of you than the clean version. It requires you to decide to keep living well after the unsatisfying conclusion, which is harder than it sounds. They kept the records clean. They kept paying attention. Fitch, as Amelia had predicted, kept his distance and his patience, and the distance was enough. Spring came, and with it the particular renewal of ranch work that leaves no room for dwelling, calving season, planting, fence line work undone by winter, the 100 tasks that accumulate when the ground is frozen and announce themselves all at once when it thaws. Amelia moved through it with the competence of someone in her second full season, which was different from the first in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first season she had been learning the rhythm. The second season she was inside it. She knew what came next before it came, could feel the schedule of the ranch the way she could feel weather, as a pressure and a direction. Eli turned 3 in April, which he marked by attempting to climb the fence to Franklin's paddock for the first time. Not successfully, but with technique that Pete said showed structural understanding, if not sufficient respect for consequences. Wyatt lifted him over, stood him on the fence rail with both hands steadying him, and the boy stood there in the April wind with his eyes enormous, and his hat clutched to his head, and his face arranged in an expression of pure, staggering satisfaction. Amelia stood at the kitchen window and watched the two of them, the man and the boy, the old gray horse between them, and felt something that had no clean name, something that was made of relief and gratitude, and the particular ache of things you didn't know you were hoping for until you had them. She had not become valuable here because someone decided she was worth saving. She had not become part of this household through someone's charity. She had become part of it the way you become part of anything real, through showing up, day after day, doing the work that needed doing, being honest about what she found and what she thought and what she wanted, and trusting, slowly, imperfectly, with regular backsliding into her own well-earned caution, that the person she was doing it alongside was worth the trust. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing, the only thing, really, that any of it had ever been about. She wrote to Mrs. Hartwell in Philadelphia that spring. She had written several times over the winter, brief letters, factual, reporting rather than confessing. This letter was longer. She told Mrs. Hartwell about the hearing and Pell and the witness account and the fence posts and the mending she'd done at Martha Greer's boarding house at a rate of $2 a week while she figured out what came next. She told her about Pete and Charlie and Franklin and Eli and the barn straw. She told her about Wyatt, not in any romantic way because she was not a person who wrote romantically, and Mrs. Hartwell would not have been improved by it, but plainly with the same directness she applied to everything. He is a good man, not a perfect one, which is the right kind. She told her that she had made it, not in the way she'd planned, which she now understood was the only honest way to describe any of the things worth having. You don't plan your way into the real things. You work towards something, and the work changes you, and what you arrive at is better than what you were aiming for because the aiming was based on what you knew at the start, and you know considerably more by the time you get anywhere worth being. She did not tell Mrs. Hartwell that she had been afraid, almost every day for the first 2 months, that she had made a mistake she couldn't recover from. She did not tell her about the 43 cents or the specific shame of the careful nod across Dawson's general store. Those things were true, and they were hers, and they were done. She signed the letter Amelia Cole and held it for a moment before she sealed it, feeling the weight of the new name. Not heavy, just present. A fact. A true thing. She sealed it and put it with the supply run parcels for Wednesday's town trip, and went back to the kitchen and started the bread. There are stories about the frontier that have a certain shape: the woman rescued, the woman transformed by a good man's love, the woman who was lost and then found by someone who saw her worth. Those stories are not untrue exactly, but they miss the harder, more important version underneath them. The harder version is this: Amelia Rose did not come to Kansas to be saved. She came to build something, and the first attempt collapsed on a train platform with 4 unsigned sentences, and she built it anyway. Not with perfect materials, or a perfect plan, or a perfect man, or any of the smooth certainties that make stories easier to tell. She built it with 43 cents and a child on her hip, and the willingness to keep walking when the walking was hard and the destination was unclear, and the people she passed weren't always kind about it. Wyatt Cole did not save her. He gave her honest work and honest treatment, and eventually, slowly, carefully, in the way of a man who has learned through specific and terrible loss how much it costs to hope for something, he gave her his honest self. That is different from saving someone. It is harder and smaller and considerably more real. Eli grew up on that ranch. He grew up knowing the names of every horse and the particular temperament of each one, and how to read weather and how to keep accounts. His mother taught him that one, starting when he was 5 with a small ledger of his own. He grew up knowing that his mother had arrived in Kansas with 43 cents and had, through work and attention and the refusal to collapse, built a life that could withstand a corrupt land claim and a dishonest man in a winter storm and the ordinary daily difficulty of being alive in an unforgiving place. He grew up, in other words, knowing that it was possible, that the worst starting point is not the last word, that the person who underestimates you is giving you something even if they don't mean to. They're giving you the chance to show up in a way they weren't prepared for. That is the thing Amelia Rose carried with her from Philadelphia to a Kansas train platform, to a boarding house, to a working ranch, to a courthouse in December to the rest of her life. Not the guarantee that things would go well, but the knowledge, earned and specific, paid for in 43 cents, and 1 lumpy mattress, and 17 different ways of reading a set of numbers, that she could handle whatever came. That is not a small inheritance to leave a child. That is, in fact, everything. The ranch stood. The record stayed clean, the land held, and on the Kansas frontier in a house that had once stood silent around a grief too big to speak, there was noise again. The noise of a household that is actually occupied, actually lived in, actually and imperfectly and honestly alive. That was enough. It was, by every honest measure, more than enough. It was the whole thing.
All right, so after this mix, we're going to do a Redux set from Cascade. That should be fun to listen to. I'm just trying to see if there's any friendos that are on. Okay. All right.